What is up guys, Blue Spooky here with a 2-hour Megamix. That is 2 hours of new true scary stories to this channel, as much as I'm able to track. If you guys enjoy this long video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing all of those ensures I can keep making daily videos for a long time to come, especially these longer ones. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' comments, even if I don't always get the chance to reply to them. Without further ado though guys, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours of true scary stories, and I will see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. This is an older story, something that happened to me almost 20 years ago, when I was 23 years old. I was writing for a popular budget travel guidebook series, and mainly worked in Central and Eastern Europe, depending on the time of year and which issues were being updated at the moment. I could be gone for several weeks, or even several months at a time. Mainly, I traveled alone. I'd run into a few problems here and there, but my experience was predominantly positive. I'd been working in the former Yugoslavia and was on my way to the Czech Republic. It was a long journey by train, so I broke it up into several overnight stops. Zagreb first, then Budapest, making each leg around 8 hours. It was late January and very bitter. There was probably a good 7 inches of snow on the ground, perhaps more in some places. I was exhausted and battling the remnants of a flu I'd picked up in Split. I left in the late afternoon and expected to reach Budapest around 10 p.m. I bought my ticket in the travel center, and when I boarded the car, about half the compartments were empty. There were definitely some other people on it though. Since the train wasn't too crowded, I managed to find a compartment all to myself. I spread out a bit because of this, and prepared for a long ride. The first part of the ride was very smooth. I worked on some guidebook stuff, wrote some notes in my journal. A few hours into the ride though, we passed over the Hungarian border, and things started to go awry. I heard them before I saw them. They were a group of teen boys, about 5 of them that I could see, and they were quite loud. I could hear them running through the train car, laughing, cursing, and banging on the compartment walls. They were loud and obnoxious, but it's not the first time I'd ever been annoyed by a group of teenagers. I didn't even look up. I kept on working on my writing. As time went on, though, they grew louder and louder. As they ran from car to car, they slid the train doors open with so much force it sounded like a bomb going off every few minutes. Then they got even louder. That's when I noticed they were standing right outside my compartment, looking in at me. I could only see 3 of them through the small window, but there were definitely more behind them. I'd seen them earlier. I glanced up at them, frowned, and then looked away. I'd learned the best way to deal with this kind of thing was to just ignore them. I didn't want to encourage this behavior, but ignoring these guys seemed to be having the opposite effect. "Lady, lady," they hollered at me. "Come have some fun." The compartment door was closed. They proceeded to mess with me by slowly opening it, pretending they were going to come in, and then slamming it shut again. They went from chanting "girl, girl" to a much more ominous "we're gonna fuck tonight, and you'll fuck us all," followed by a bunch of slang. At this point, I started to grow nervous. How was I to know whether they were just messing around with me or being completely serious? I mean, I couldn't exactly leave. I'd have to walk through them to do that. They were blocking my only exit and entrance. Then, one pulled out a pocket knife. He stuck out his tongue, ran the blade across it, then pointed it at me and grinned. I tried not to show anything, but my mind was quickly taking stock of what items I absolutely had to take with me if I made a break for it. My lack of reaction seemed to anger the one with the knife, so he switched from licking it to using it to penetrate a circle he'd made with his thumb and forefinger. "You're gonna die," he called out. Part of me figured they couldn't really do anything. There were other people in the train after all, and surely they'd hear me scream. Someone would come and help me, right? The conductor hadn't come through since we did the border crossing, so he was due for a trip around this time as well. I figured I only had to get through the next few minutes, and then they'd get bored and leave. It was at this point I noticed the curtain on the door window. I know it sounds crazy, but that's when I lost it. I'd left the curtain open so people walking by could see the compartment was occupied, but now all I could think was that if they came in, all they'd have to do was pull the curtain closed, and nobody walking past would see what they were doing to me. At least one of them had a knife. They were taller and bigger than me, and they outnumbered me. I started to tear up. What was going to happen to me? I was 23 years old, but a late bloomer. I had a history of sexual assault, too. My day pack was in my lap, and the only things I had in there that could be weapons were a fingernail file and a butter knife. I reached into my bag and fumbled around until I had one in each hand. The first guy slid the door open and stepped inside, knife pointed at me. Another voice filled the corridor. I didn't need to speak the language to hear the anger. The kids ran from my compartment, the one dropping his knife. I watched as a middle-aged man dressed in blue stomped after them. A few seconds later, the train came to a grinding stop. The world outside was so creepy. All I could see was snow and blackness. There were no lights in sight. After a few moments, the train started back up again. The boys did not return, though. I was just starting to feel some relief when the man returned to my compartment. It seemed he was the conductor. "You speak English?" he asked. I nodded. I made them leave. They're gone now. I thanked him, and he came into my compartment and sat down across from me. It felt good having another person in there with me, especially an official. I felt safe now. "It's okay. They're gone." "Thank you," I replied. I was so scared. He nodded knowingly and leaned back into his seat. "It happens sometimes. We get people like this. They can't hurt you, though." I honestly felt like I was going to pass out from emotional exhaustion. Just as I was starting to let my guard down, though, the conductor leaned forward again and said, "You need the fee." Oh, I produced my ticket and showed him. "Well, here's my ticket." He looked at it, shrugged, and handed it back to me. "This is a ticket, yes, but there's a fee for Hungary. You didn't pay." This was the second time I'd made that route, and I'd never had to produce anything extra on the train itself. Now I started feeling sick to my stomach. He quoted me a number around 50 USD. I knew he was taking advantage of me. I wanted to argue, but then he said, "If you don't pay, then you have to leave now and get off with those guys." We were literally rolling through the blackest night I'd ever seen. The snow looked like it would come to my knees. I didn't want to be dumped in the Hungarian countryside with those boys who were harassing me. I felt like I didn't have a choice. He waited while I rooted around in my backpack and produced $30 in a combination of Czech, Bosnian, Croatian, and Slovenian bills. I left myself 20 USD. With that, he took the wad of cash and stuffed it into his pocket, and then he bolted out of there. Once he was gone, I gathered my things and headed to the bathroom. I had to pass by the other compartments as I walked down the corridor. It was that moment I realized I'd been wrong the whole time. There were no other riders in the other compartments. They'd all left at some point. I was the only person in my car. If the guys had come in and attacked me, nobody would have been there to help. I'd have been all on my own. I cried for 5 solid minutes in that tiny bathroom, and then threw up in the middle sink. So I walk to most places I visit, because being severely visually impaired, obviously I cannot drive. I walk at night during summer, which lasts anywhere from April to October if we're lucky. This is probably not the safest idea, but I'm from Texas, so temperatures of 100 degrees plus aren't that unusual. One of my more usual destinations was a convenience store a few blocks from my previous home. I set out one night, just like normal, to grab myself some Pepsi and a candy stash. Our town was not very big, and most other people drove everywhere. It was very unusual to come across anyone else on my route to the store because of this. On this night, though, a man suddenly appeared out of nowhere and started to talk to me like he knew me. He asked me where I was going, and I told him I was just going to the store. It wasn't unusual for people to keep watch on me, because hard of hearing blind girls with forearm crutches might need a bit of help, I guess. This guy had no reason to be out there, though, and was walking way too close beside me. He asked me where I was going, and I told him just in case I was overreacting. I sped up as much as I could, since this part of the route was very dark, with only a subway that had already closed for the night. He was definitely not there for a $5 footlong. I tried to appear calm. I was shaking to the point, though, that I was afraid I'd drop my crutch, which was the worst thing I could do right then. Especially after he started talking about how easily he could have his way with me in a ditch and no one would ever know. I felt sick, but I continued on walking. What else could I do? The store was only about 20 yards away. Luckily, I happened to know the guy who worked there on the graveyard shift. I got safely inside. My friend handed me a bag to carry my stuff until I was ready to check out. When I got up to the register, he began to speak loudly enough that my ears hurt. I had to turn my hearing aid down because it hurt so much. "Hey babe, you ever find my 3DS? I played along, and he opened the half-door thing and I sat on a stool like it was normal. The creepy dude came over and slammed his Bud Light and a 10 on the counter. After being handed his change, he went outside. We waited for a bit before my friend spoke to me. He's still out there waiting by the ice machine. After about 20 minutes, he still had not left yet. My friend called his manager, and after explaining the situation, she told him to lock up and take me home. He did, and even walked me in through my door. We stepped inside together. Catherine told me to give you this. He handed a keychain to me and showed me how to lock and unlock the pepper spray. Then he said this: "Hey, call us before you come from now on. That man has been following you for the last 4 weeks or so. He comes in after you every time." He left, and I made sure the door and window was locked that night. So this event happened to me back when I was 20 and was going back from my aunt's house, where I'd give lessons to my little cousins each week. I was a student back then, and it happened in winter when it was quickly dark around 5 p.m. I must also say I'm a woman, and unfortunately that's not very helpful when it's getting dark out. I was going back to the train station to take the direction home because I lived quite a few stations away from my aunt. At that time, it was around 6 already. It was really dark and cold outside. I remember being particularly tired too, so I didn't give much attention to the direction the train I was waiting for was going to. As soon as it rolled in, I went inside. It was really crowded, so I stood up for quite some time. That didn't help much with how tired I already was. After some time, a seat finally cleared up. I snapped it up as fast as I could. I let out a heavy sigh that attracted the attention of the people beside me. I was a little ashamed by that, so I just looked down at my phone and didn't pay much attention to the others for the rest of my ride. At some point, though, I noticed the guy in front of me looking really intensely right at me. Then again, I was so tired I didn't really think much about it. I just continued watching whatever was on my phone at the time. As we rolled into a station, the train stopped, and the driver informed us that was the last stop. I had my headphones on, so I didn't hear the entire message. I thought I had to stay on the same train and it would just go back on the same line after a few minutes. While everyone else went out, I just switched places to go somewhere with no one beside me. It was a seat comfortably near the window. When the train was soon to start again, the man that was looking at me earlier walked straight into my zone and sat right in front of me. I was focused on my phone, though, and didn't pay much attention to him. It was quite strange, though. The entire wagon was empty where I was. There were tons of empty seats where he could have sat, but he chose right next to me. The train started up again, and I was happy to finally be able to approach my home. As some stations passed by, though, I noticed something odd. The stations were the ones I'd already passed by before. In fact, the train was going back to the direction of my aunt's house, not where I lived. I realized I hadn't heard the message right in the first place. I was a little bit angry because of this, but most importantly, I laughed at myself. It was the first time I was so tired I'd done such a mistake. As I was smiling at my own foolishness, I started to look around me. I saw the man sat before me. He was looking confused, while switching his gaze between me and the windows. I laughed and gave him a small smile. I thought he'd also gone in the wrong direction too, since he had been in the same train for a long time now with me. But he didn't smile back. Instead, he glared at me and got very angry. I remember getting a chill at that moment. My senses finally woke up to make me realize there was something wrong with this man. I stopped the video I'd been watching and started to think. I had two options. The first one was to just stop at the next station, change sides to take the train that would actually get me home. That was the most logical and normal option. I didn't know why, but something in my gut told me I shouldn't go home alone tonight because of the man in front of me. I decided to stay on the train instead and see if he would get off before me or not. After all, I was sure this was not his direction either. I stayed. At least 4 stations passed by, but he didn't move at all. Instead, he seemed to get much more confused and angry with each passing station. He was glaring at me a lot, switching to the windows each station, as if he was waiting to see which one I would get off on. Now he was giving me a real scary look. I tried to avoid his gaze as much as possible. At some point, he started to push his leg against mine. It's like when the train is riding fast, and because of its movements, you sometimes touch people near you and bump slightly into them when it's crowded. Him doing that was not natural though, because the train was almost empty. After some time, I was really getting awkward. Even when I changed position to be away from him, he would constantly rub his legs up against mine. It pissed me off. I looked straight at him, and then I knew immediately I was in danger. He was looking at me with this huge smile on his face, since he'd noticed I was now reacting. I was terrified. When the train stopped again at a station, I didn't really think. I jumped out of my seat and started to go out. He followed behind me. I was really scared. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want him to follow me home because I lived in a really secluded place. If he were to follow me all the way, at some point he would be able to do anything to me. Near my own home, there would be no one around to hear or help me. I was trying to think fast when suddenly I got an idea. I stayed near the train before the door closed and walked near it like nothing happened. He was still following me and looking at me, but I tried to remain calm. When I heard the sound of the door about to close, I jumped back inside the train again. Right when the door was closing, he couldn't get in on time. I saw him looking at the closing doors in shock. He looked at me like he wanted to kill me. I went back to my seat and stared out the window looking at him to see what he would do. He was so furious. I was scared he was going to break the glass and jump right at my neck. The train finally started again. It was gradually pulling away from the platform. The man was staring at me, following me with his gaze the entire time. When the train finally passed that station, I started breathing normally again. After that, I stayed on a few stations and finally got off and changed sides to take a train in the direction of my home. I was looking behind me the whole time and ran home as fast as I could. It was only when I was in my room that I fully realized what had happened. That event was really a change for me. Before that, I was really carefree when I took the train or the subway. But from that time on, I started being a lot more cautious of my surroundings, especially when returning home at night. My mom's dog Punky was a very sweet, loving dog. She was an ESA dog, but trained to be a service dog for PTSD before she lost her leg. I had never seen her get aggressive with anyone in the entire 12 years she'd lived. Never growled, never nipped at anyone. She had no sense of smell, so she loved all animals and people. A real gentle giant among our little terriers at 60 pounds. What I'm getting at here is that her barking at something and being aggressive was so wildly uncharacteristic that I only ever saw it happen one time. I was 11 at the time this happened, and at home with my siblings who were 6 and 2 respectively. My then stepdad was at work. My mom had to go to the gas station to grab a pack of cigarettes. It was only a mile or two away, so it wouldn't take that long. For reference, we lived in a 2-bedroom trailer in the middle of the woods on a dead-end road at the time. You had to really make an effort to get down there, find our house, navigate that rickety-ass driveway, and find our door. I was sitting there at the computer, having a grand old time watching some YouTube videos, when all of a sudden our dogs jumped up and started investigating down the hall. My siblings were both napping in the bedroom at the end of that hall at the time, so I figured they just stirred a bit and scared the dogs. Then though, Punky jolted upright, stood on the couch and puffed her chest out. Her ears were perked up, fur standing on end, tail straight upright. She started to bark loudly. It boomed through the living room and echoed all around. All of a sudden, she jumped off the couch and went tearing down the hallway. I was already on edge because I'd never heard her bark before. I stood up and went to look down the hallway, ready to fight off what I was assuming was a shadow monster based on how the dogs were acting. But then, I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. We didn't get visitors because of how weird our home was location-wise, so my 11-year-old mind had no clue what to do here. The only people who would ever show up were family, and they would never knock. I slowly walked toward the door. The knock drew the attention of the dogs, and they came running back down the hallway, all except for Punky. I felt better with these 3 yappy dogs in the room with me, even if they were the size of a New York City sewer rat. I opened the door just a bit, only to see standing on our porch the sketchiest man I'd ever seen. I can still picture him perfectly. Extremely thin, a taller man with dark hair and a sunken face, heavy bags under his eye, and half-managed hair, like he'd just given it a quick brush and figured that was good enough. Everything about him just seemed too thin, a little too shallow. His clothes were all off too. They were nice, but like fake nice, you know? Like a clean, newer-looking t-shirt and new jeans. Like one of those suits you'd buy from a factory or something. All his clothes were real dark too, despite the fact it was summer in Texas and it was definitely well into the hundreds that day. He had a plain, unlabeled bottle in his hand. It looked like it had been covered up and taped over. I stared at the man in confusion. I definitely had never seen this guy before. I asked him what he wanted. He smiled in a way that was obviously fake and spoke in the same voice retail workers do. "Hey there, kiddo, I'm trying to sell this here carpet cleaner. You mind if I come in and show you how good it works?" Alarms were already going off in my head. This was just way too weird. Looking back with an adult perspective, the fact he didn't even ask if my parents were home at all is unnerving. That meant he probably knew they weren't, and that was why he was there in the first place. I should have told him to get the fuck off our property, that I'd have to go talk to my mom. I didn't say that, though. Instead, I shook my head and said, "We don't have a carpet." "Well now, hold on a minute. It works on other things too." He took a big step toward the door and shook the bottle at me. I started to freak out and was about to close the door. Thing is, our front door wouldn't even lock. It was broken and basically useless. I was sure something very bad was about to happen. I was terrified as I thought about what to do in the few seconds I thought I had before it did happen, when all of a sudden I heard it. Punky had crept up from the hallway, lowered towards the ground with her teeth bared, snarling like she was feral. Slobber was flying from her mouth, her ears down, and she was ready to pounce. The guy heard it too. As I looked toward Punky, she tried to lunge past me. I just barely caught her as she tried her hardest to duck past me and attack this guy. The man freaked out and ran off the porch without saying another word, booking it down the driveway as I let Punky out along with the rest of our dogs, and they started chasing him. Our small dogs chased him down the driveway and stopped about halfway, barking and jumping about. Punky stopped just on the porch though and watched him vigilantly, staring into the distance until he disappeared. As he ran down the road, I swear I saw someone join up with him when he got onto it. The second he disappeared, Punky's entire body language changed, and she went back to being the sweet dog I knew. No barking or growling, just laying around, mouth and throat covered in slobber still. I realized my siblings were still in that room and ran to check on them. When I got to the bedroom, my siblings were sleeping soundly still, but the bedroom window was wide open, the curtains pushed all to one side, and items on the dresser in front of the window all shoved around. Someone had definitely been trying to climb through, no doubt in my mind. From what I can gather, the bedroom window was visible from the couch where Punky had been sleeping. I think someone was trying to climb through the window before Punky went after them and scared them off. The man at the door was obviously meant to distract me. They definitely hadn't expected Punky, because most of the time she was with my mom inside, while our small dogs were the ones the public saw more often. I don't know what they intended to do, but after my mom got home, she took all of us to my aunt's house. On our way there, we saw the men walking up someone else's driveway. Men, plural, because we watched a second one split off to wait by the road. I worked at a Jimmy John's restaurant for a couple of years when I was at college. It was a nice place to work, plus I had a car, so I easily got hired as a delivery driver. There's something about doing the majority of the work in your car that makes the job so much more enjoyable. Plus, I could take my study notes and play them in the car while I drove around. Early on during my sophomore year of college, I began delivering to a man who lived in Verona. He was right on the edge of our delivery area and was a nice older man, likely in his early 70s. The first time I delivered to him, he seemed quite taken with me. I could tell. After that first delivery, he began to ask on the phone whenever he placed an order, specifically for me. I know that most people might think this was creepy right away, but honestly, it didn't really come across that way. He was a very nice older man, seemingly. Never came on to me, didn't even give me the once-over when I was over there. He always gave me a very healthy tip as well. As a Jimmy John's driver, that could be a rare experience. It really didn't matter to me if he liked me or whatever. He was never creepy or weird about it, so it was just fine. At least once a week, he would call in an order, and each time he would ask, "Is Jen working today?" With that, I would go and deliver his sandwich to him. During finals week that year, I decided to go ahead and work anyway. I didn't need to take time off to study because I could always just study in my car anyway. One afternoon, around 2 hours into work, the snow started falling very steadily, and it began to accumulate quickly. We didn't get a whole lot of orders that day because of this, so ironically, I wasn't really getting that much studying done. I did have my books out in the car, so I went to go out and grab them, and got to work as well. At about 9 p.m., the phone rang. I answered it, and before I was even able to give my name, I heard the familiar voice of that old man asking me, "Is Jen working today?" He placed his regular order, and I hopped in my car to drive over to his place. I had to go rather slowly because the snow was so slippery this night. I was born and raised in Wisconsin, so I was used to driving in the snow, but this particular snow was a bit sloppy. I found myself skidding quite a bit. It was piling up fast on my windshield, so I had to keep my wipers on full blast just to remove it. It was very difficult to see where I was going. Fortunately, Jimmy John's only delivers really close to their stores, so I arrived at his house pretty quickly. I parked on the street right behind another car, which appeared to be warming up. I thought that was odd because with the snowstorm in full gear, I didn't think anybody should be out driving tonight unless they really had to. Home was the perfect place to be. I grabbed the old man's order and hopped out of the car. Looking at the house though, I noticed he had all of his lights off this time. which was rather unusual. I went up and knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again. This time, I heard a voice from inside the house shout out at me, "Come in!" This was different than every other time I delivered there. The man had always come right to the door. He'd never asked me to come inside either. This was really odd. I really didn't want to go into a customer's house, so I knocked on the door again. Again, I heard him yell at me to come in. After considering it for a moment, I finally decided to go inside. The man had always been nice to me before, and I had no reason to expect this time would be any different. I found it pretty unlikely he would have been the type of creep that would spend months trying to gain my trust, just to invite me into his house one random evening and do something to me. That seemed kind of silly to me. I opened the door and walked in. The house was dimly lit by a lamp in the corner. I was in the front hallway. I looked around and peeked into the living room, where I saw the man rocking in his chair right by the fireplace. There was a very small fire going. I couldn't really see much else, other than the man's silhouette. I was really unnerved at this image. I felt like I should just turn around, go back outside, get in my car, and leave. It was then that something caught my eye. On the floor, right next to his chair, I saw a knife laying on the carpet. That was the clincher that convinced me to leave. Just as I decided to do so, I heard the man call out softly, "Jen, don't go." In my head, I was telling myself, screw that, this is way too weird. I had been moving slowly, but I noticed the man was making no attempt to get up and follow me. I turned and rushed toward the door. Just as I was about to reach it though, I saw through the glass something moving off the side of the door on the porch. My heart jumped in my chest. I realized that somebody was standing just out of view of the door, pressed up against the house. I realized right then why the man hadn't gotten up to follow me. He had an accomplice outside who was going to grab me as soon as I left. It seemed like an eternity passed as I stood there, wondering what to do in this situation. I now had a creep both inside and outside the house. Regardless of what I did, it seemed I would be subject to one of them. The man outside moved. I knew he'd noticed that I was not acting. As he moved toward the door, I quickly reached out and grabbed it. I locked it tight. The man stared at me through the window. He was wearing a black ski mask over his face, but I could see the anger in his eyes. He began to pound on the door, and I did the only thing I could think to do. I took out my cell phone and dialed 911. I showed him the screen as I hit the call button. He got the hint and turned and left. He jumped into the car I'd seen warming up and drove off. It turned out the old man hadn't been trying to hurt me at all. In the time period of about 30 minutes that it had taken since he'd placed his order and the time I got there, someone had broken into his house, beat him up, and tied him to his rocking chair. The intruder was right in the middle of robbing him and had been loading things into his car when he saw me pull up to the house. Apparently, he was going to do something to me on my way back out. Well, even though nobody was hurt in the end and the old man gave me a pretty good tip for helping him, I just couldn't take the stress of that job anymore. I quit after and got a job waiting tables. Much happier experience. This is the weirdest thing that ever happened to me in my entire life. I can't actually explain how it happened either, but I can guarantee it did happen. During a snowstorm one winter, I was hanging out with my then girlfriend. We were having a wonderful evening all in all, and we decided we should watch a movie and order a pizza. I hated the idea of making a pizza delivery guy deliver a pizza in the middle of a snowstorm. My girlfriend, though, insisted they often got very busy when it snowed out, so I broke down and let her order a pizza. We then settled in and I tried to decide what movie to watch. Nearly 45 minutes after we placed the order, my girlfriend began to get very impatient. I tried to tell her that with the driving conditions so poor, combined with that increased business she had told me about, she had to give the poor guy a little bit of leeway as to when he would arrive. She was having none of this though, and kept on saying bad things about the pizza place. Finally, about an hour after I'd placed the order, I noticed the lights of a car pulling up alongside the house. Outside, I heard someone come up on the porch and begin to knock on the door. I went to the door, opened it, and of course, there was the pizza delivery. He gave me the pizza, which I had already paid for, and I gave him a tip. This was despite the fact my girlfriend insisted he didn't deserve one since he'd taken so long to get there. She did this right in front of him, mind you. I apologized for her behavior and sent him on his way. I put the pizza box down on the kitchen counter and proceeded to get into a fight with my girlfriend about being so rude and nosy. I placed the pizza box on the kitchen counter and then proceeded to get into a big fight with my girlfriend about being so damn rude. I'd never seen her act that way about something before, but it seemed she had a bug up her ass about pizza delivery guys for whatever reason. I warned her that she had to be careful, or one day when she ordered something she would end up with a spit in her food, if she was lucky. If she was unlucky, it could be something worse. As the two of us stood there arguing, suddenly I heard another knock at the door. Confused as to who could possibly be coming over to the house during the snowstorm, the two of us went to answer it together. Upon opening it, there was the pizza delivery guy standing right there. He apologized for the long wait to get to us. We were surprised. We told him that our pizza had already just been delivered. He was insisting that was impossible because he was the only driver working that night. He told us that's why it had taken him so long to get there. I didn't know what to do. I had already paid for the thing online, so it didn't seem like a scheme to try and screw us over or anything. The driver seemed genuinely confused and upset as well. My girlfriend began verbally assaulting him. I couldn't understand why she was acting this way. After a moment, I became fed up with it and just took the second pizza anyway. I gave that driver a tip as well and he left. We walked back into the kitchen, with my girlfriend nagging me about how she had been right about them all along. She told me I shouldn't have tipped that second guy, because clearly he was just conning me. It just didn't make sense. I was getting really fed up with how she was acting. I decided it would be best to just have our pizza and watch the movie. I got myself a plate and proceeded to open both boxes. When I opened the box delivered by the first driver though, my girlfriend began to scream. I looked inside. There was what looked like the torn up bodies of animals scattered all over the pizza. On the back of the box in red was written, "Next time," my girlfriend's name. And I didn't know what it meant, and I never found out, as we broke up shortly afterward. Considering the way my girlfriend was acting towards the pizza delivery guys, maybe she'd pissed off somebody pretty badly in the past. Weird thing is, I have no idea how the first guy even knew we'd ordered a pizza. Whatever it was and whatever conflict my girlfriend had with the pizza delivery people, I'm glad I never had to experience anything more. I'm the son of two first-generation immigrants from China. My parents came over during the 1960s, after the immigration quota was raised for the 1965 Immigration Act. They settled down in Chicago, and I was their first child born in the United States. I grew up in the 70s and early to mid-80s. My parents opened up a restaurant in the 70s that I still own today. Although I currently enjoy a lot of success, that was not always the case. In fact, in the early days, the restaurant didn't make much money at all. To keep from hiring too much outside help and increasing costs, all the family had to pitch in to help. I'm sure you've seen this happen at some smaller Chinese restaurants. I would come to the store after school and sit in the booth by the cash register and do my homework while helping. If the phone rang, I would be the one taking the orders. When the customers came to pick up their food, I would hand them the food and take their money. I didn't get paid for this work, but it was really minimal effort, and it didn't really interrupt my studying very much either. When I was 16 years old, enough to legally drive and work, my parents hired me as a delivery driver. I was happy to finally be making some money. Basically, I only worked for tips, but it was a decent amount of money all the same. More often than not after that, my younger sisters and brothers took over the hosting duties. This happened to me back in the mid-1980s. I just finished up at school and was headed in to work. We expected a pickup and delivery business that day because there was supposed to be a snowstorm that evening. My parents, as I'm sure you can imagine, were not the sort who would cancel delivery just because of the weather. The flurries had begun to fall before I'd even left school, and by the time I was at work, it was falling quite heavily. It seemed at first that my parents were wrong about the extra business tonight. For the first couple of hours, we didn't even get a single customer. It was after 5 p.m., and the snow was piling up significantly. Then I heard a customer come into the store. My younger brother was supposed to greet him, but I decided to do it since we were so slow. The man who walked in immediately made me uncomfortable. I didn't really know why. He didn't look threatening, but he was acting very weird. He was squinting hard, and we had a big aquarium, which he walked over to and began to speak to the fish. Then he walked up to the counter. After looking at the menu for a moment, he actually said this to me. "Hey, yeah, so what do you recommend, Fu Manchu?" I groaned, but tried not to show my annoyance. This sort of behavior wasn't totally unheard of, and my parents usually tolerated idiots in order to make more money. I suggested he order the beef and broccoli, and when I did, rather than order, he looked at the menu for quite a while. When I was about to say something, he looked away from the menu and looked down at me. He met my gaze head on, and the wild look in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. Can I help you with something, sir?" I finally asked, a little bit of annoyance in my voice. He didn't answer me, and even though I hadn't meant to, I began to drum my fingers on the counter in impatience. After a long pause, he asked me, "Do you know karate?" In fact, I did not. This was not an uncommon stereotype back then, but I didn't answer. The man began making fake karate noises at me. I just stared at him in disbelief. "So, you know karate? Tough guy? You want to settle this outside?" "Settle what?" I said to him. "I haven't even done anything to you." The man was getting quite boisterous with his karate noises. His loud voice attracted the attention of my mother. She came out and saw the man giving me a hard time. When she assessed the situation, she demanded that he leave. The guy stopped and pulled a pocket knife out of his coat and began to wave it at my mother and I. He told my mother to make him leave. When he started to make a ruckus again, my dad and two of the men from the kitchen came out, each with their own much bigger knives. The chef demanded the man leave, and he did after giving me a long, dirty look. As the evening deepened, the snowstorm began to bring in the regular influx of customers. I had to let my brother and sister take orders because I was getting tons of delivery requests. It was quite rough. The snow was falling very heavily, and I had to drive real slowly. I had to pile several orders into the car at a time and drive to each building at a snail's crawl. I had 3 orders to get out around 10 p.m. Fortunately, 2 of them were in the same apartment building, so after delivering the first, the second and third should be easy. I got out of my car, the snow hitting me in the eyes, and I went up to the buzzer. I was immediately buzzed into the gate and walked up to the building. The first hallway was long and empty. I knocked on the door at its end, delivered the order, and then got into the elevator to go to the top floor. Arriving at the next apartment, I knocked on the door. It won't come as a surprise to anybody hearing this that the man who answered was that racist man from the restaurant earlier. As he opened the door, I felt like a ball of lead had formed in my stomach. I tried to keep my composure and hand the man his food. The creep wouldn't give me money though, and he didn't try to take his food either. He just smiled at me. After a long pause, he asked me once again, "Do you know karate?" My heart was beating fast. I wanted to turn around and run off. I didn't answer and tried to hand the food over to the man. He wouldn't take it though. Finally, I shook my head no. I guess in retrospect, I should have said yes. He was obviously asking me because he wanted to know how easily he could beat my ass. Although I was expecting a beating almost right away, he held his hand out for his food. I handed it to him. He held it for a moment, before throwing it on the floor and stomping all over it. I made to run off, but the man grabbed me and shoved me backwards, my back hitting the wall across the hallway. I hit my head too, and felt fuzzy for a moment. The man walked out into the hallway with me. I wanted to get up and leave, but the wind had been knocked out of me. I didn't know what to do. This guy looked like he was gonna kill me. Not much time had passed between the time I'd fallen against the wall before the man was standing over me. He was about to kick me in the face when someone in the apartment behind the wall opened their door. A man in his early 20s looked out and noticed me laying there. The other man immediately fled back into his apartment and slammed and locked the door. The new guy helped me up and offered to call the hospital for me because it seemed I'd damaged my head. I declined, but I did ask him to walk me out of the building. I didn't tell my parents what happened. They were pretty overprotective, so I knew if I did, they wouldn't let me deliver anymore, and I really liked that job. Fortunately, I never had to interact with that man ever again. Let me start by adding a little info for context. I'm 29 years old, but often get mistaken for being much younger than I am. I look so young, sometimes people mistake me for being 13 to 15 years old. I have a real baby face, and I'm petite as well. I try to use this to my advantage if I don't want to talk to someone. So yesterday, on Saturday, I went to the mall to pick up a new dress since my cousin is getting married next month. I wasn't picking up anything too fancy, since the wedding wasn't super big or traditional. Still though, I thought I should try to look nice. As I picked my last of 5 options and made my way to the dressing room, I was approached by a woman who asked how old I was. I told her not to worry about it and went to try my things on. I picked out what I liked and exited the dressing room. When I returned the unwanted dresses to an employee, I was again approached by the same woman, who decided it was her business to ask how old I was. Again, I told her to leave me alone, and tried to find some good shoes to match my dress. In the shoe section, I was approached yet again by this woman, who all of a sudden decided I was a child. She started yelling at me about how 12-year-olds shouldn't be left in the mall alone, and asking me where my mother was. I kindly let her know I was an adult, and that I was fine. This seemingly upset her. I guess she reported me to a security guard as a lost child. When approached by security, I answered all his questions and even showed my ID to prove I was an adult. I let him know she'd been bothering me. As far as I know, he told her how old I was and to leave me alone. The rest of the day though, wherever I went in the mall, this woman followed me the entire way. Finally, I got annoyed enough to just leave, where this woman followed me out to my car and proceeded to try and shove me into her car, telling me she would drive me home. I let her know once again that I was an adult. I had my own car and was going to drive myself home. I got into my car and drove around for a good hour to make sure she still didn't follow me, before finally going home. My mother is a primary school teacher in a rural town in Australia. About 10 years ago, she was offered the principal position at a tiny mountain school about an hour away from where we lived. This mountain town was kind of a long-running joke for us townies. Just mentioning it would cause any local to start humming the dueling banjos theme from Deliverance. The population was just under 40 people. Most of them had the same last name, and they were all pretty well known for keeping it in the family. However, being promoted from teacher to principal was a pretty big deal for my mom. We decided we'd all live at the old schoolhouse during the week and come back to civilization on the weekends. When we arrived, I was shocked at just how small this town actually was. One street surrounded by thick scrub and brushland. Dilapidated houses tucked away out of sight from the main road. No streetlights, no shops. The school was tiny, with only about 14 kids in total, and all related to each other in some way. I hate to say it, but some of the students had that Innsmouth look, if you know what I mean, that only comes with generations of kissing cousins. But overall, they were all really nice actually. All the kids behaved well, and my mom enjoyed her new job a lot. I had just finished high school and was waiting for university to start, so I spent most of my days alone in the schoolhouse reading or cooking, while my siblings were away at school and my parents were at work. However, as the weeks progressed, I found myself spending more and more time at the school itself helping Mom, because I just couldn't stand being alone there. With no TV reception and only an old Walkman and some shitty cassette tapes to fill the silence, I found myself rapidly fluctuating between bored and extremely paranoid most of the time. There were always a lot of sudden and random old house noises that really didn't sound like they were the house at all. Scratching, shuffling sounds at odd times that frequently sounded like footsteps or perhaps even voices. I tried to pass it off as paranoia for as long as I could, but shit finally hit the fan one day. I had just happened to stop my tape mid-song when I distinctly heard a man's voice quietly whispering random numbers from the front veranda. 40, 40, 9, 40, 17. I ain't afraid of no ghosts, but I am afraid of hillbilly home invasions, so I took off to the school and reported it to my mother, who of course did not believe me. Then I went to my father, who didn't believe me either. My sister did though, at least. She said she hadn't slept well since she was awoken nights before by the sound of a branch scraping on her bedroom window. Only catch was, there was no tree around. She told me she thought she had seen a man standing in the backyard late one night too, but when she mustered the courage to look once more, he was gone. Pretty soon, we were the first teenage sisters to ever insist upon sharing a room together. My parents both thought we were being ridiculous. However, one evening after dinner, we were visited by two of the local men who told them something that changed their mind. After asking if we'd had any trouble at the house, they proceeded to tell us that everyone in town had been experiencing trouble for over a month now. Apparently, these men dressed in makeshift camouflage gear had been wandering down along the main street at night. It came to the town's attention because while the town was used to strangers in hunting gear, these guys were covered in leaves and grass and sticks. No one knew who they were. Definitely not the locals of the town. There were at least 10 different people, always traveling alone, and always dressed in that same weird camouflage clothing. At first, the locals of the town were just having a laugh about it. It certainly wasn't common to see people dressed as walking bushes outside of a Warner Bros. Cartoon, even during hunting season. It was very absurd and funny, at least at first, until these guys started sneaking onto private property. One lady had woken up to find something moving under her house, shining a flashlight up through the floorboards. Another man had come home to find a camouflaged guy hiding crouched on his roof. One man heard muttering from his back porch, only to go out and discover that someone had unchained his hunting dogs from their run and tied them to his back doorknob, then drawn a large X on the door. Pretty much every local had been terrorized by one of these guys in the night, and some of them even brazenly during the day. The local guys were really nice actually, and warned my dad to keep things locked up tight and stay vigilant, and let them know if anything happened. Over the course of the next month, many similar events occurred. My mother even saw one of the men hiding on the edge of the school grounds during the day and called the police. The sightings were frequent, as were the chalk X's. One of the locals even saw a man in camouflage standing on his front lawn whimpering like an animal in the early hours of the morning. The local guy who'd seen him threatened him while his wife called the police, but the man silently stood his ground, smiling at them in the dark. The local man eventually lost his cool and beat the heck out of this creeper, who stood there smiling and laughing through the entire beating, then just got up and walked calmly back into the bush, still smiling and even bleeding before the police arrived. Unfortunately, there's not really a cool ending to this story. The school closed not long after due to government funding cuts, and my mom got a new job closer to home, which meant we left pretty quickly. We moved back home after spending only 5 months up in mountain country, and no one in the family was too sorry about that. I often wonder who those guys were to be out there in the middle of nowhere, and why were they doing all of that exactly? A few years ago, I was leaving my grad school office late, around 10 p.m. to catch the bus home. I walked from the university campus via relatively busy, well-lit streets to the main north-south road in my area of the city. I was waiting for the bus at a shelter, as it was in the middle of winter and snowing. It was fairly cold. The bus ran about every 15 minutes, so I wasn't really worried or nervous or anything, just kind of patiently waiting there to get on my way home. I was listening to my music with my headphones in when I noticed a guy walk up to the shelter. I looked at him briefly, did that little Canadian half-smile of acknowledgement, and went right back to listening to my music and reading through Reddit. A few minutes passed by and I could hear him start talking to me now. Well, I assumed it must be me. I was the only one around. I looked up and the man was staring at me, smiling a bit oddly and speaking to me as well. I took out my headphones. Excuse me? He kept on smiling and blathering on, asking me about my day, the weather, what I like to do, etc. I don't know what it is about me, or perhaps people in general, but I'm a perennial people pleaser. I don't like confrontation, and my main aim in life seems to be to keep the peace at all times. So I answered a few of his questions politely and as non-specifically as I could, with one of my earbuds still in. He just kept on blathering on and on though. At this point I just kind of tuned him out and nodded politely. This went on for about 10 minutes, when I just had this sinking feeling in my stomach about this guy. Like I could tell something was just a little bit off now, enough to make me start getting nervous. After about 10 minutes, I could see the bus rolling on its way up, which was a huge relief for me. No one else had arrived at the bus stop that entire time. Luckily, I could see at least 10 to 15 people were already on, which was great for me. I hopped on the bus and sat near the front. The guy sat across from me, so he could keep on talking to me. I had originally intended to head right to my house, to the west of the street I was on, but after this guy decided to be my personal parrot, I decided to go to my boyfriend's instead. Pretty much in exactly the opposite direction. I was still getting an uncomfortable feeling from this guy, so I decided I would push the bus stop button a stop early, just to see what this guy would do. The bus came to a stop at my request, and the man got up immediately. I didn't move.
"Oh, isn't this your stop too?"
he asked me. Oh, whoops. You know, I must have hit the wrong stop button on accident. I'm kinda tired, you know. The man looked at me.
"Oh, well, that's funny. I must have mixed it up too, because this isn't my stop either."
He sat back down right behind me. At this point, I was pretty freaked out. I hit the bus stop for the next stop and texted my boyfriend to come and meet me at 109th Street. I got up to leave once the bus stopped, and the creepy man followed close behind. I crossed the road and he still followed, still jabbering away at me, asking me all kinds of questions. Once I got to the other side of the road, I told him I had to go now, and my boyfriend was meeting up with me. He looked irritated at even the idea of me having a boyfriend, and tried to follow me more. I stopped and told him I was going alone from here on out.
"Well, can I have your number?"
he asked. I panicked. I kinda froze. I gave him almost my number, with the last 4 digits completely scrambled around. I read it off to him, said goodnight, and started walking away really quickly. I had almost started running, and had made it 20 steps away. I could hear him now jogging after me.
"Hey! I think there was a mix-up. I tried calling that number and it wasn't you."
He jogged right up next to me, and was still smiling that same weird smile, staring at me. How weird," I said, grabbing my phone. I pretended to check it for a missed call, and texted my boyfriend that I needed him to come right now. The man leaned in.
"So, what's your real number then?"
he asked. I honestly don't know what I would have done. I think I would have just given it to him. I had no idea what to do. It was extremely cold, it was winter, and it was dark in this tiny residential neighborhood I had entered. I knew I couldn't outrun him. Luckily for me, at that exact moment, my boyfriend came sprinting up. He was fairly large and somewhat imposing. I turned around to the man and said, "Have a good night." I jogged up to my boyfriend and launched myself at him. I didn't look back at the creepy dude, but I did tell my boyfriend to please make sure the doors were all locked and the windows all closed before we went to bed that night. My family grew up in the rural area around where we lived. My parents weren't rich or anything, but we did have a fairly decent life. This was in the 70s or so things were a lot different than they are nowadays. It was a lot more common back then to see someone driving down a country road with an open beer between their legs. Although I don't live out in the country now, nor have I in quite a long time, I at least like to think that things like that don't happen nearly as often anymore. I learned to drive myself when I was about 12 years old. This was not unusual for me or my family. And it wasn't too strange either for one of us to take the car out and go somewhere. I had a lot of friends my age who chewed tobacco as well. I tried it a few times, but I didn't really care for it. Around this time, I was good friends with a guy named Vance. We had grown up in the same general area up on the ridge. Our houses weren't really that close together, but we rode the same school bus to school. We were friends all the way from kindergarten until sometime in high school. The reason the two of us stopped being friends in high school was due to a girl he had liked for years liking me even more. Although I wasn't really interested in her and would never have dated someone my friend had his eye on, this made him really angry. After a while, he just kind of stopped talking to me. A while further after that, he became very antagonistic to me as well, which was pretty horrible because no one wants to lose a friend in a situation like that. It's not like I made the girl like me or something. When I was 17 years old, I was home by myself on a weekend night. I decided to take one of the old cars and see a different buddy of mine who lived a bit further up the ridge than I did. It was about an hour's drive to his house, since it was a dark dirt road the entire way there. You had to be real careful out on some of these roads. They were right on the sides of hills, and there was not anything like a guardrail to keep you from driving off the side and dying. When I left that friend's house to go home, it was already pretty late. I went outside and could see it was actually a little bit foggy out. It was not ideal to drive this path in that weather, but it just meant I would have to take my time and be more careful when driving. However, it was not too long after I'd begun that I noticed some lights behind me. Another vehicle was now coming my way. The road wasn't really wide enough for more than a car and a half, so this person could not pass me by. Still though, he didn't stop at all. He drove up upon me really fast. In fact, just before he slowed down, I almost thought he was going to slam into me and shove me off the cliff. He had gotten as close as possible to hitting me, then backed off just a bit. When this person was about a car's length behind me, he started to flash his high beams on. Then he sped up just enough to almost slam into me again. Just before he'd hit me though, he slowed down. Now he kept his high beams on, which made it very difficult for me to see the path ahead. I tried to pull my car over just a bit to let this guy pass me by. I was really trying to let him go, assuming that's what he wanted. This guy made no attempt to pass me though. He did the exact same thing, pulled up really close to me, then backed off again. This time he began to honk his horn angrily as well. I began to get very nervous. Every time this guy repeated this pattern, I got even more scared. I tried to speed up now, which I was very hesitant to do. I didn't like driving fast down these roads, even when there was not any fog. That didn't change anything though. When I sped up, he matched me perfectly. He kept getting close as if he was going to hit me off the side before backing off yet again. He did this over and over, while still honking his horn at me. I don't know how long this kept up, but finally we got into the bottom of the hill, so there was no risk of running off the side anymore. We were still in a highly forested area though. Thankfully, by that point, I was not far away from home. I thought I could make it there, and at least I knew my family would be home by then. If this guy followed me all the way home, my brothers would be there to help me kick the crap out of him. No sooner than that thought entered my head, however, the car did its same pattern again. This time, though, it did hit me. I reacted by slamming the brakes, which caused my car to spin and skid off the road. The only thing I remember after that was nothing. I woke up in the hospital. 3 months after the accident, my car had slammed right into a big tree. I hadn't been wearing my seatbelt in that moment. The only thing that kept me from flying through the windshield was the big steering wheel that my head and chest had bounced off of. I had some pretty bad head injuries, and I had been out for the entire time. I guess I had opened my eyes after a month, but had not been acting like myself. They told me I was aware, but it was like nobody was there. I don't really remember exactly because it was so many decades ago. I had a violent and sort of feral behavior that required me to be restrained to my bed for a while. Then, suddenly one day, the day I felt like I woke up, I just went back to normal. I never found out exactly who was driving that car that rammed me. However, some other people who knew me in high school later told me that Vance had been bragging that it was him after it happened. Vance's dad worked at the police department, so there was never an investigation to see if he had done it. That, of course, convinced me that he had. I don't live out in the country anymore, but I really hope it's harder these days for crooked people to get away with things like that now. I'm a 28-year-old man from England. Near the end of August, I was out with some friends in a bar to celebrate my birthday. It was near the end of the night, and we decided it was time to go home, having been out for about 8 hours going on this point. We were up to the first floor of the bar, and my friends went down the staircase to the main doors ahead of me. For reasons my advanced drunkenness has caused me to forget since, I decided to try taking a shortcut off the stage next to the stairs instead. I'm guessing I just stepped off the stage thinking it was a short drop to the ground. It was closer to about 5 or 6 feet, and I hit the ground dead on with my legs straight and my knees locked. I heard a snap. Well, I knew instantly something was seriously wrong there. Cue a 999 call and a surprisingly calm ambulance ride to the hospital after being dosed up on gas and air. When we arrived, they gave me a thorough x-ray and discovered I'd broken both of my legs like a dumbass. By this point, I'd sort of already guessed though. Your right foot pointing down instead of up is a pretty good indication something's really wrong. My heart sank even further when the attending doctor told me they'd have to admit me ahead of corrective surgery in the next couple of days. By now, they'd given me quite a bit of morphine. I was still huffing gas and air like a champ as well, so I was fairly out of it. A porter wheeled me up to the ward and introduced me to a nurse, who explained I was going to be put into the men's ward, as they'd had to separate genders the previous day into different rooms. Even out of it on pain meds, I remember thinking that was quite a weird thing to mention. My nurse set me up in my room right by the ward entrance. My bed was one of 5 in there, and was next to the room's shared toilet/shower room. It was around 5 a.m. now, and the entire place was quiet and dark. As the nurse took me through all the admittance procedures, I could vaguely make out a guy in the opposite bed. Unlike the others in the room, he was awake and sitting up in his bed to watch me being brought in. I couldn't quite see his face, but the patchy white hair on his head was catching the moonlight coming in from the windows, so he must have been an older guy. What struck me as odd, though, was how he was just sitting there, completely still like a statue. No movement, no noise. I couldn't even hear him breathing. He was just sitting there focused on me the entire time. Before the nurse left, I asked him to draw the curtain around me so I would be shielded from view, and eventually I managed to drift off to sleep. I woke up the next day to find my parents had been contacted and were sitting by my bed. Standing next to them was the guy from the bed opposite, chatting away like they'd known each other for years. I'm not exactly known as a people person, and given that for obvious reasons I was quite a touch grouchy, I'll admit that I was annoyed my parents were letting a total stranger stand right over me while I was unconscious. Of course, there's no way they could have really known that he'd creeped me out a little the night before. The man introduced himself. Here we'll call him Mick. He seemed friendly enough, one of those harmless old men who comes across as lonely and is just keen to talk to just about anyone. I found out he was in his early 70s, quite short and round, and was on the ward because he'd fractured his collarbone in a fall. When he eventually wandered off, my parents told me he seemed to be a nice man, confirming he just appeared pleased to have any new people to talk to at all. During the course of that first day, my parents eventually left. The doctors came around to fit me up with splints before my surgery, planned for day 3. They made it clear I'd be in the hospital for at least a week or so, and I would not be walking for a few months at the very least. Not what I wanted to hear. During all of these conversations, Mick was always lurking nearby, listening in. When the doctors left, he came right to my bedside. Rather than stand, he sat down in the chair next to me and asked me to repeat what the doctors had said. I wasn't in much of a mood to chat, and because I got it into my head that he was harmless, I asked why he'd need to know. He'd only been standing a few feet away, and obviously he must have heard everything. The second those words left my lips, though, his entire demeanor changed immediately. The sweet old man that had been sitting in that chair just beside me was gone. His face went blank and flattened out. He fixed me with this strange stare, and one corner of his mouth lifted into a lopsided grin. My wife just died, you know. Again, I'm not a people person, and conversations about death are certainly way outside my wheelhouse. I stuttered a little, trying to find appropriate words. I was starting to say how sorry I was to hear that, and asked how long it had been. Given the odd grin, I guessed it had been quite a while. About 3 weeks, just like that, gone. His face never changed the whole time. It dawned on me now that maybe he was not totally mentally present at that point. He never broke eye contact either, just staring at me grinning. One of those looks that wasn't immediately sinister, but goes on for too long, you know. Thankfully, the nurses came in at that point to serve dinner, and Mick retreated back to his bed. He watched the TV the rest of that day. I put my iPod on so I had an excuse to not make any more conversation. Right then, I just thought he was a little left of normal, and it was more weirdness that I could certainly deal with. When the lights out came around, I asked the nurses to draw the curtains closed around my bed for me. Although I was still in quite a bit of pain, I drifted off early. During the night, though, I was suddenly woken up in what had to have been the early hours of the morning. One of those gradual awakenings where you know something's not quite right, but you're not present enough to work out what yet. The ward was almost totally dark and silent again, especially around my bed with the curtains drawn. I assumed the weird feeling was down to, being in the hospital with 2 graphically shattered legs, and turned my head to the left onto the pillow. Then I nearly rolled off the opposite side in complete shock. Standing inside of the drawn curtains, right next to my bed, was Mick, just standing there watching me sleep. Like you do when you've had a shock, I said something stupid. "Hey, this isn't where you sleep." Nothing. That same blank stare, barely a ruler length from my face. I thought he might just be sleepwalking, but he didn't have that glazed over look in his eyes to go with it. He seemed perfectly alert, just happy to stand there observing me. "Mick, how long have you been standing there?" That's when I got a special kind of chill, the kind you get when something really freaks you out. Rather than reply, he smiled so wide. I saw both rows of his teeth. He shuffled back around the curtain to his own bed. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. Because he'd never left the room, and I certainly wasn't going to be going anywhere on my own, I couldn't really mention it to the nurses. I did text a few friends who were visiting the next day, and told them to watch out for him when they came through. He stayed away during their entire visit though, and acted like a normal old innocent man. As the day went on, I decided I must have made more of it than I should have. Perhaps I was just on edge because of what I had going on, and being in unfamiliar surroundings. That day I went in for my surgery. I came to about 6 hours later to find myself hooked up to a morphine pump. As a result, I was completely out of my tree high the entire evening, and was in such a good opiate-fueled mood I totally forgot about Mick. Big mistake. It got to the early hours again. I was playing a game on my phone, oblivious. The nurses were checking in every hour or so. They disturbed the curtains around my bed a lot as they'd come and go. The last nurse had left a gap about 6 inches wide where the curtains met, typically right in the part opposite Mick's bed. Mick was normally a very, very loud snorer, so I was reassured by the noises coming from him that he must be asleep at this point. I've got to assume because of the morphine that I stopped paying attention. Suddenly, I realized I was acutely aware that I couldn't hear the snoring any longer. I also couldn't remember how long it had been since I last heard it. Nervously, I looked at the gap between the curtains, but I couldn't make anything out. I was just about to write it off and go back to my game, when just left of the gap, I could hear my name being called out. Not the normal way of saying it, not a whisper, more like a sinister groan almost, low and gravelly and menacing. I froze. I mean, what's the protocol when a pensioner has gotten out of bed in the middle of the night for the second night running to mess with you? I sat there paralyzed, more paralyzed than I already was because of my legs. I was suddenly aware of my sense of vulnerability. I was completely immobile. It's not like I could get up and leave or something. I was stuck in my bed with heavy bandages and braces around both of my legs, hooked up to an IV. I slowly moved my hand down from my phone to push the call button for the nurses. Just as my hand reached it, the long groaning of my name stopped, and so had my hand. Had he seen me reach out for it and gone back to bed? No, he was still there. About 30 seconds passed by, presumably the length of time it took him to notice I was not going to press the button yet. Then came the heavy breathing, low rasping intakes of air, followed by extending groans to expel it, over and over, right from underneath the foot of my bed. That was my limit. I hit the call button and the light went on above my head. I heard the buzzer sound down the hallway at the nurse's station. There was a burst of movement behind my curtains, and I heard the nearby toilet door quickly open and close. Not long after, a nurse responded. Mick was still in the toilet, but because it was close by, I beckoned the nurse nearer so I could whisper. I told her what was going on this night and the previous, and asked if something could be done. She nodded and said she'd be right back. While she was gone, Mick emerged from the toilet. I heard him quietly crawl back into his bed and pretend to be asleep. Thankfully, the nurse had fully closed my curtains, so at least he could not see me now. An hour passed by, and eventually the nurse returned. I was expecting to be moved elsewhere, but instead she told me I couldn't have a sleeping pill due to being on morphine. I tried my best not to be impolite. I calmly told her I had not asked for a pill. I asked for something to be done about Mick. The last thing I wanted in this situation was to knock myself unconscious with even more meds. She just sort of shrugged and half explained that all of the wards were full. Then she disappeared, telling me to get some rest. Needless to say, I could not sleep for hours. Mick's snoring eventually resumed, and the day finally caught up with me. I cautiously allowed myself to drift off. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Mick made small talk, which I didn't really respond to, and eventually left me alone. That afternoon, a guy younger than me was admitted with a broken leg as well. This guy was 18, but looked about 12. It was absolutely ridiculous. Mick didn't seem to think so, though. Suddenly, this guy was the focus of all his attention. I felt sorry for the fresh meat, but grateful I might be able to relax now. That night, I slept pretty well, until about 3 a.m. I was suddenly awoken to the weird sensation on my left foot, the toes of which were poking out of the top of my bandages. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw Mick standing there inside of my drawn curtains, playing with my toes, running his fingers along them, brushing them, pinching them, moving them around, like he'd wanted me to wake up and see what he was doing. He was not looking at my feet, though. He was staring me dead in the eyes, unblinking. I'd like to say I lost my shit with him, called the nurses in, and had him moved elsewhere immediately. But the mind's a weird thing. so that's not what I did. I just sat there open-mouthed and watched him as he kept rubbing his hands along my feet. I think it was disbelief that kept me quiet, mixed with fear of what he would do. He might have had more than 40 years on me, but I was completely trapped and totally at his mercy. Needless to say, I didn't want to do anything to piss him off. Eventually, he seemed to get tired of messing with me and disappeared behind the curtains once more. For obvious reasons, I sat awake for the rest of the night, watching and waiting for him to show his face again. Every now and then, I could hear my name being groaned out. By morning, it was a mixture of furious and terrified. I'm not the kind of person who assumes the role of victim very often, so I hated how easily this old man had reduced me to a paranoid wreck. Every time he got up to stretch his legs or get some water, my entire body would go rigid, expecting him to appear at my bedside once more. Instead, he went back to devoting all of this creepy attention to the new guy again. That afternoon, Mick was called away for a scan, so I finally had some time to speak to the 3 other guys in the room about what had happened. None of them had any idea about Mick's nightly visits. One of the guys had been there a lot longer than I had, though. He had been around when the wards were divided by gender. I asked him about what had happened. To cause this. He responded that he wasn't totally sure. He just knew that something had happened during the night, and the very next morning everyone had been in separate wards. For obvious reasons, I had a pretty good idea of what that something might have been. When Mick got back, he glumly announced he had been cleared to go home, and had an ambulance booked to take him there in an hour or 2. He started making his way around the ward, saying goodbye to everyone, and he left me till the very last. He placed his hand on my foot. "You look after those legs in the future. They're fragile things, you know." I half smiled and told him I hoped he felt better soon. I was assuming the interaction was the last one I'd have. I'd finally seen the last of this man. I picked up a magazine and started reading. No sooner than I had done that, though, I looked up. I was about to yell out until I saw what Mick was doing. His hand was clamped around my foot, squeezing it so hard his knuckles had gone white. Thankfully, this was not the area where the break was, or that might have seriously damaged me. After that, his stare was back, completely vacant. Before I could respond, his mouth opened, and out came the same raspy voice I'd heard saying my name in the night. "They're very, very fragile." He let go of my foot and turned around, then shuffled back to his bed to pack. A couple of hours after that, he was finally gone. I did fill the nurses in before I was discharged, but none of them seemed to care all that much. They dismissed what I'd experienced as either partly drug-induced or just misinterpreted behavior. This happened a while back when I was 15 years old. I just discovered the rebellious act of sneaking out. This was probably my 4th or 5th time doing so, I believe. This one night, I decided to go and meet up with my boyfriend. At this point in time, we weren't together yet, but we really knew we liked each other. You know how that sort of thing goes. When you're with someone you like, you tend not to really pay attention to what's going on around you. The night started out pretty fine, actually. We were both having a very good time. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, because we had both gotten pretty damn high. I do remember what happened, though. We'd met up and snuck to this elementary school that had a decent-sized field, with some hills and trees toward the end of it. From where we were sitting, we had a very clear view of the school, as well as the basketball court. The school was illuminated from the side lights, so we could easily see anyone walking by. It wasn't easy for people to see us laying there, though. To our left was a little pavement path that led to a townhouse complex. So here we are, sitting at the edge of this field, just gazing out at the stars and talking about random shit together, when we started to hear the crunch of gravel coming from the school. Because we were both high and paranoid, we immediately turned our attention to the illuminated basketball court. We watched as a man walked by with his bike and didn't seem to notice us. After he passed by, we almost instantly forgot about it and resumed talking, laughing, and being a bit loud. Perhaps 10 minutes later, though, we hear that same crunch of gravel go by. We go silent immediately and look out toward the school. Once again, it was that same guy. This time, though, when he reached the courts, he didn't keep on walking. He stopped at the edge of the field we were sitting on and stared out at it for maybe a minute or so. It looked like he was searching for us. We were a little bit creeped out at this point, so we started to quietly pack up our things to leave. All of a sudden, the man began to walk towards us. As soon as he'd stepped out onto the field, it became so much more difficult to see him. The light from the school couldn't reach that area. We took this as our cue to get the hell out of there. The only way to leave without being extremely visible was to take the path into the townhouses. We jumped up and tried our best to be quiet. We walked through the pitch-black path that led to the townhouse complex. We were not sober, by the way, so we were extra freaked out. I kept on checking behind us constantly. For some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling something bad was going to happen. We finally reached the end of that pitch-black path and made it to the decently lit complex. We started to ease up a little bit and began trying to find our way to the main exit. That was the closest way out besides the way we'd come in. As we were walking throughout the complex, we started to relax and talk a bit more. Once we turned the corner to leave, though, just as we were about to reach the exit, we saw the same man with his bike waiting there for us at the exit. We stopped for maybe 2 seconds. The man dropped his bike on the ground and started to sprint directly at us. I muttered a quick, "Oh shit!" My boyfriend and I began sprinting as fast as we could away from this guy. We turned down random corners and down little back alleys, not once checking behind us. I don't know when or where we lost him, but we became very tired. We had to stop and hide in some bushes. We noticed after a while that there was no man in sight anymore. Still though, we stayed in that same position for about 20 more minutes, just trying to calm down. At this point, we had both pretty much sobered up, so we decided to try and leave once again. We began walking through the complex once more. When we made our way back to the main entrance, we both saw the man's bike was now gone. We were unsettled by this. We had no clue where the guy could be, or when he was going to just randomly appear again. Lucky for both of us though, we made it home safe and sound that night. I'll never forget the feeling though, of my heart sinking when we saw that guy blocking our way out. By far one of the creepiest things I've ever experienced. So this happened to me in 2009. I was 22 at the time, but I'm very short and small, and can oftentimes be mistaken for a young teenager. I had just had a driving lesson, and while normally my instructor would drop me off in front of my home at the end, that day he had somewhere to be straight after, so he dropped me off at a nearby bus stop instead. My apartment block was about 500 meters away, at the end of a very long stretch of quiet road. It was an area that was still being built up at the time, so all there really was a couple of abandoned old houses to the left and right, my apartment block at the very end, and that's pretty much it. It was rare to ever see cars going there that weren't just going straight to the apartment block, because really there was nothing there to go to. Maybe a clinic a couple of streets away, so you would occasionally get someone who was lost looking for directions to that place. It was around 8 p.m., and it had just gotten dark outside. The street was barely lit. Still though, it only took a few minutes to get from the bus stop to my house, so I really didn't think that much of it. That was until a car drove past me, but then started backing up in the middle of the street until it was driving slowly right beside me. I looked over and could see a woman was driving. There was a man in the passenger seat. I sort of slowed down, thinking they were going to ask me for directions to the clinic. The woman instead asked this: "Do you live here?" Now I was thinking they definitely wanted directions. I stopped to help them, but then she said, "It looks like you're lost. We're the police. We're gonna take you home now." Mind you, this was a totally normal vehicle. These people weren't in uniform or looking in any way official. I was incredulous. I was literally stunned. All I could say was something like, "You're taking the piss." Immediately, I was thinking these people must have mistaken me for a 10-year-old or something and were trying to kidnap me. The woman was getting very agitated. She kept on telling me, "You have to respect the police. Get in the car right now." I was shocked. I was angry. At this point, the car stopped. I saw the woman moving to open the door. I burst into the fastest sprint of my life while fumbling with my phone to call my mom. I screamed at her to buzz me in because I was in danger. My dad ran out of the house to meet me and started to look for them immediately after, but the car was already nowhere in the area. He informed the police, but nothing ever came of it. Years ago, I lived in a condo with just my 2 dogs, Smokey and the Bandit, brother and sister from the same litter I'd gotten as puppies. For reference, their mother was a Sheltie, Smokey's father was a German Shepherd, and Bandit's was a Husky. They were both good-sized with long, thick coats, which made them look a lot bigger than they actually were. Personality-wise, though, they were both big babies who loved people and attention, and would happily lick you to death if given the chance. One night, I got home late, around 2:30 in the morning. I took them out for a quick run and a piss, something I had done many times before. I lived in the back side of the condo on the ground level. The backyard was basically a huge park-like setting, divided into intersecting pathways, kind of like a square with 4 quadrants. That was surrounded by other condos and houses. The area in front of mine was a big field with a pathway about halfway through, running just parallel to the condo. To the left of that was an area around the same size, divided between a large playground area and a big forest with a pathway running through it. I headed straight out of my condo and across the pathway that divided that big open field. And that was when I noticed someone, a tall, skinny man, dressed all in black, whistling while walking along the path I had just crossed over. As I ran with my dogs, I noticed the whistling had suddenly stopped. I looked back over my shoulder, only to see the man had diverted off the path as soon as I was in front of him and was now walking in a direct line towards me. Immediately, I thought to myself, "Oh shit, this can't be good." I took a hard left and ran to the playground area. It was well lit, but there were also big hills I assume were leftover dirt from construction or something. I ran around that hill into the dark, where I thought he wouldn't be able to see me. I stayed there in the dark for a minute, trying to formulate a plan. Luckily, I knew the area very well, having spent hours walking everywhere with the dogs. I snuck towards the forested area, creeping towards the trees to where the path ran through, circling back around towards my condo. I kept close to the shadows while praying that I had lost him. The forested area ended basically where the backyard of my condo began. Still hidden in the darkness, I looked around the open area ahead. I couldn't see anyone. I made a break for it and started running out of the forest like hell. Up to this point, it was just like any other walk for my dogs, who'd happily galloped alongside me the entire time, seemingly unaware of any danger. As soon as I left the protection of the forest, though, I saw that fucker jump out of waiting from a nearby group of bushes. I had a good head start on him, thankfully, but I didn't know how fast this guy was. I kept on running. What happened next still amazes me to this day. As I was running, the dogs still at my side. Smokey all of a sudden stopped dead in her tracks, turned around and assumed a snarling stance. She began to growl at the man, which stopped him dead in his tracks. Bandit stuck right by my side like glue until we got to my patio. I turned around and looked back, almost laughing at that fucker. Smokey was standing her ground in full-on guard dog mode, while the man was standing there looking at her, hands up in surrender. I called Smokey to come back to me. She backed away slowly, barking and growling at the man, until she decided it was finally good. She turned around and ran right back to me. I kept my eyes on that guy the entire time. He never moved until the dogs went back inside, at which point I followed them soon after. I immediately called 911 and within minutes the entire backyard area was swarming with cops. And the cop who interviewed me said there had been numerous reports of sexual assaults in that area, and they figured it was all that same guy. Unfortunately, other than tall, skinny, and wearing all black, I had zero info on what the man looked like. I don't know if they ever caught him or anything more on it really. When everyone was gone, I had a good long cuddle with my wonder dogs, complete with them licking away my tears. After the adrenaline and everything wore off, the gravity of what could have happened and how damn lucky I was finally hit me. I got off work at around 10 p.m. and headed home. I lived alone and always made sure my front door was locked before I left. When I arrived home though, I found the door was now unlocked. I knew for a fact I had locked up tight when I left, because like I stated, I always double check. I have severe OCD and would not have forgotten to do so. I was too obsessed with my routine to ever forget. I was thoroughly unsettled by this. Immediately, I retrieved my pistol from the drawer right next to my front door. I set down my bag of fast food and looked around the dark living room, fumbling for the light switch. Once the light flicked on, to my utter horror, my apartment was in complete disarray. Paperwork thrown all over the floor that had been put away in my office. My social security card lying out in the open, and my birth certificate too. I quickly made my way to my office. Once I entered the room, I found all the drawers were open. My computer had been turned on, and it was at the lock screen, as if someone had been trying to log into it. I checked the rest of my apartment, but I didn't find anyone there. I put my gun back and immediately phoned the police. They arrived fairly quickly and took a report of the break-in. They asked me if I had any enemies, or if I'd made anyone mad recently. I responded that I hadn't. No such thing had occurred. And furthermore, I'm not the type of person that quarrels often with people. Needless to say, I was quite dumbstruck as to what I'd stumbled home to. I cleaned up the mess and attempted to go to sleep, but I tossed and turned most of the night, laying with my gun under my pillow. I'd like to add that I was already a somewhat paranoid person, so the whole thing naturally freaked me out. The next day I had off, so I left to go hiking with my girlfriend. I left around 9 a.m. and stopped by the Starbucks right next to my apartment. While I sat in the busy drive-thru line, I looked up, only to notice a man staring at me from across the street, on the same side as my apartment complex. The strangest thing about looking at this man was, though, just how much of a resemblance to me he bared. The guy had done up his hair the exact same way as me. He was about the same height and weight, too. He even wore the same glasses and looked to be about the same age as well. He didn't have any expression on his face, just stood there still as a statue staring at me. It was my turn to grab my order, so I grabbed my stuff, and when I went to pull out of the drive-thru, the man was now gone. The day went on as planned, and my girlfriend and I had a very great day together. I told her about the incident at my apartment previously, and the weird man who looked just like me. She joked that perhaps my doppelganger had broken into my apartment or something. After I parted ways with my girlfriend and made my way home, I was a little bit nervous to return there, fearing that whoever had broken in before might have returned. Whatever they had been there for that night, they seemed to be looking for something in particular. I arrived at my apartment and made my way back to my unit. I lived upstairs, and as I approached those stairs to my front door, I could hear someone moving around upstairs. I was a good distance from the stairwell at this point and was alarmed. I didn't have any neighbors that lived upstairs, so no one should have been up there. I stopped to see who it was, and to my shock, it was none other than that same man I'd seen earlier that morning. He walked fairly quickly, and it looked like he was trying to be as quiet as possible. I shouted at the man to stop, but as soon as he heard me, he took off running. He hopped the fence that separated the complex from a large field and disappeared into the night. I ran upstairs to my apartment and tried the doorknob, once again unlocked. I went inside and was horrified. All over the walls of my living room were pictures of me and my girlfriend from that day. Pictures that looked as if they'd been taken right from the tree line next to the trail she and I were on. I once again called the police. They came and searched the apartment, as well as the entire complex. I told them about the man I'd seen running into the field. When they searched it, they returned with a pair of eyeglasses and a wig. The police took the items they found into evidence and opened up a case. They stationed 2 cars outside my apartment and informed the manager about what was going on. It's been almost a week since this started, and nothing else had happened since. No more random break-ins or creepy photos of my girlfriend and I. To be fair though, I'd been staying with a coworker of mine until things died down. I have no idea why whoever this is targeting me. Based on the items the police found in the field, my guess is this person is trying to pretend to be me for some odd reason. I don't know what that means. I have 2 Australian Shepherds. One is my personal dog and the other is a foster dog. Both are roughly around 60 pounds. I took them on a walk today at a local wilderness area that consists of about 50 miles of trails in total. I'd been there many times with my dogs and never had any problems. Anyways, we're walking down the trail and they did bark at the few people we saw. Every time I saw someone, we'd step to the side off the trail and let them pass me by. I'd apologize to them, the person would smile and keep on walking, and we'd all carry on with our merry days. So when I see this one guy approaching, and the dogs go into alert mode, we stepped off the path so he could pass us by. The man instead walked up to us, and then stopped in place. "Oh, I don't think your dogs like me." I told him they were just nervous around everyone. I apologized for them being so loud. At this point, I was barely able to hold them by their harnesses, so they were super close to me. They were going absolutely crazy. They were angry even. I know it was not great behavior, but nonetheless. The man began to whisper, "I'm sorry they don't like me. I'm so sorry." At this point, I was weirded out. He'd not broken eye contact with me or blinked at all, and seemed rather unfazed by the dogs all said. I again told him it was not his fault. I told the dogs to go with me, and began to guide them away. The man told me he was going to keep moseying on up the trail. I said alright and told him to have a good day, and we walked off in opposite directions. I thought it was a very strange interaction, but hey, we can all be a little bit weird at times. I tried not to think too much of it. About 2 minutes later though, I heard the man suddenly call out from behind me, and I turned around to see him quickly approaching. "Hey, I really want to be friends with your dogs. I don't want to leave them on bad terms. I want to make some new friends." He walked right up. If I came upon nervous dogs, I'd always leave them alone, or if I did try to make friends, I'd squat down, talk gently to them, extend a hand. He never did this, though. He never even looked at the dogs, because he was staring at me without blinking once the entire time. This time, the dogs went absolutely nuts again. I didn't grab their harnesses, though. I let them have the full length of the leash to put some distance between me and this man. The man was going insane, shouting now how he just wanted to be friends. I told him I didn't think that was going to happen. He tried to approach still, but the dogs were having none of that. He began to whisper to himself, "I'm sorry. I don't think they're going to be friends with me." Again, he was not even looking at them though. He was just staring at me unblinking. I told him to go away. He finally turned around and left, and I called my sister for the remainder of the walk. It was so strange. I guess I don't know for a fact that that man had bad intentions, but I'm sure glad that my dogs were there and made it abundantly clear he was not going to follow me anymore. I work at a retail store and I detest my job with all my heart. Because I was a dumb shit and said I was always available though, they'd routinely fuck me over and put me on nights. I whine and bitch and moan and digress. I'm okay working nights since I get to see my boyfriend when he picks me up at least. Boyfriend usually gets off at 10:30, but he doesn't leave until 11. Most nights I'd have to wait for him to arrive. On top of that, he had to make a 10-minute drive as well, so I'd have to wait around an hour and 40 to 45 minutes. That didn't really bother me that much though. He'd call to tell me he was coming and make sure I was still alive at least. Earlier in the week, an Uber driver had kept on asking me if I was someone named Lenore. I told him no, and he did it again, but this time kept asking if I was sure. How the fuck am I not gonna be sure of my name? Fortunately, at that moment, my boyfriend pulled in and honked at me, causing this Uber creep to speed away. I'm a paranoid penny, so this made me wonder if he'd been watching me or something, and knew my boyfriend always came late. Then I tweaked out, since I'd kept on getting these weird phone calls from a telemarketing agency or something. Whenever I'd answer though, no one was there, and they'd hang up immediately. Was this connected? Was the government watching me? Did I only have 7 days left to live? Well, fast forward 3 days later, and I'm just standing there listening to some music, waiting for him to pick me up and call me. He finally did and started cracking a joke about how he was glad the creepy Uber driver didn't answer. As we started chatting the shit with each other and joking around, suddenly this Indian woman walked up to me. I didn't hear what she was saying at first, since I had noise-canceling headphones. I could tell she was getting closer and closer though, and kept on calling out to me. Finally, her hey reached my ears. I looked over to her, smiled, and went back to talking to my boyfriend. She did it again though, so I excused myself. Yes, may I help you? Do you need a ride? She asked. She looked nice enough, but something was off about her. Her car was parked at the stop sign, and I could see there was someone else in it. No, my friend is coming to pick me up right now, actually. Thank you. I noticed there was a man in the driver's seat, and she wasn't wearing a uniform from either of the stores near us. She started to ask me again. Are you sure? I can give you a ride. Do you need a ride? Get in, come on, you need a ride, right? I was beginning to feel a little uncomfortable. My preschool don't get in a stranger's car training kicked in, so I politely declined again and went back to talking to my boyfriend. Hey, are you close? I just pulled out, I'll get there, just stay on the line. That woman's gone now, right? No, she was not gone. In fact, she was standing 6 feet away glaring at me. She looked very annoyed. I told him in code that no, she had not left. She had in fact remained there leaning on the car watching me. She was looking angrier with each passing second as well. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the man tell her something. She looked at me and began to interrogate me. Your friend's not here. You need a ride? Where's your friend? He probably forgot about you. That's okay, we'll take you where you need to go. It's cold, come on, tell us where you live, we'll drop you off. At this point, she got closer to me. I tried to avoid her by moving to the farther end of the plaza strip. Honey? Yeah, so about my sister? She's gotten closer, but I'm pretty scared she's too far away from home. Something might happen. Hurry so I can tell you. I said a code as the car drove up next to me. Now she looked extremely pissed. Get in the car now. At this point, she opened the car and began trying to push me inside, pulling me, yanking on my jacket. She was a taller and bigger woman than me, so she even tried to pick me up. At this point, I'm pretty sure my bowels threatened to release. I was screaming and kicking and wiggling. Meanwhile, I could hear through the phone him yelling that he was on his way and he was calling the police. Now my mind was running 1,000 miles an hour. I was panicking, thinking I was going to be raped or presented as some weird present for her husband. He looked very content with her efforts to kidnap me. Get in! Shut up! I will hit you! I started crying as she managed to push my torso into the car. My right hand was locked to my phone. She began trying to pull it out of my hand. My boyfriend was panicking, telling me the police were sending an officer right now. She shoved my face into the leather seat. My airway was obstructed, and she was not letting me go. She was bigger than me, stronger than me, and she knew it. Her whole weight was pressing onto me. I tried not to panic so I didn't black out from lack of oxygen. All of a sudden, I started getting mad as shit. Her husband said something in Punjabi. She lifted one hand up and leaned down, trying to get something out of the front. Immediately, I used the arms I'd been using to push myself off the seat to jab her in the stomach. She recoiled, letting go of me a little. I headbutted her, tossing my melon back as I screamed, fear-stricken and adrenaline-hazed. Finally, my boyfriend pulled in. I bolted to his car, as the Indian woman was sitting stunned on the ground. After I shut the door, he sped off towards his house. When we got inside, I broke down, babbling about how scared and terrifying it all was, and how if I hadn't had that opportunity, she might have taken me to her house and done God knows what. After this incident, the police officer they dispatched got there 20 minutes later, and of course didn't find anyone. My boyfriend talked to his boss and was granted the ability to leave early to come get me. I'm still weirded out by cars stalling in the plaza. This happened about 3 weeks ago. I'm generally a slightly paranoid person as it stands already, and I've listened to many of these types of stories. I'm a small woman in her early 20s who lives alone in a smallish condo/apartment with her cat. It's on the second floor of the building, where I moved in a few months ago. There are 2 doors one must enter to get inside my apartment. First is outside leading into the building, and second is obviously my apartment door itself. Tenants have keys for the first outside door, which only has 1 lock, whereas the actual apartment doors have both locks and deadbolts. Otherwise, a visitor has to be buzzed in to be allowed inside. For some clarity, there are 8 apartments per building in my complex, with an outside door on either side of the building. Mine is closer to the back, and is situated directly above a currently empty space. My downstairs neighbor to the left is around my age, and the only neighbor I'm actually close with. She's often away though, staying with her boyfriend. This means that while I technically live near others, my home is very isolated. There is an outdoor light situated next to the door, but I'd noticed when returning home that the bulb had either broken or burned out, and hadn't thought to contact maintenance to fix it. It was already pretty late at night and I was tired anyway. There hadn't appeared to be many others home in my building, as the parking lot on my side wasn't particularly full. I was taking care of a few chores around the house at around 10 p.m. It was Friday night, so I was running the dishwasher and folding up laundry. I'd had a pretty long week at school, and arrived home probably an hour to an hour and a half before. My cat was kind of keeping me company as I puttered along. It was hard to hear much outside when the dishwasher was going, and I was already distracted. But I did notice a sort of soft rustling sound coming from outside. It didn't sound too strange aside from being fairly repetitive. I didn't really know what it was at this point, but being constantly anxious, I was too frightened of the dark to look outside the window to that side of the building. This might very well have been totally unrelated, but I still think it bears mentioning. Fast forward a bit. I was standing at my kitchen counter working on a report on my laptop. Over the sound of the dishwasher though, I heard a soft knock on my door. I was unsure at first if I'd even actually heard anything. I went still and waited for a moment. There it was again, quiet but a little longer and faster. This made me pretty uneasy. It was late at night. My first thought was that it might be one of my neighbors. I approached the door silently and looked out the peephole. As I mentioned, the only neighbor I know well is the young woman who lives downstairs, but I am familiar with what all the others look like. The man standing outside was completely unfamiliar to me. Tall, wearing either a dark blue or black jacket, Caucasian, and with very dark hair. I had no idea who this guy was. What was very unusual was just how close he was standing to the door. Even distorted through the peephole, he was so close I would guess him to be standing right up against it, leaning his face in and staring through the peephole. There was an odd sort of energy in his stance, if that makes any sense. I felt extremely unnerved. I was glad I'd made very little noise when walking over. I backed up about 3 feet from the door and waited. I'm not totally sure how much time passed, but he stood there a couple of minutes even longer than that before I heard him go downstairs and through the outside door. Now, I've had a neighbor from downstairs knock on my door in the evening before to ask if I was experiencing a power outage like him. He'd brought his wife with him, probably to reassure me, and had stood a reasonable distance from the door after knocking firmly. That's exactly what this strange guy didn't do. I know I'm paranoid though, so I try to convince myself I was making a big deal of nothing. I told myself this was probably just a similar situation. I was far too immediately uncomfortable though to consider answering the door. I decided to listen to my gut instead. I texted both my mom and my male friend about the situation. My friend offered to come keep me company, but by that time I had talked myself out of my nervousness and assured him I was fine. I went to sleep about an hour later and woke up having almost completely forgotten about it. Shit got weird the next day though. Only in the context of what I saw next morning did that knock begin to seem frightening. I had agreed to accompany my mom and her boyfriend to a yard sale that morning in some nearby neighborhoods. They were picking me up early, around 7:30. My mom gave me a call from her car when they arrived on my side of the building to let me know to come down. I grabbed my bag, went out my door and downstairs, but as soon as I opened the outside door, something was very clearly wrong. The handle turned very loosely in my hand, and the door popped open very easily. Upon shutting it again behind me, the handle itself completely fell out of the hole. Looking back, I wish I'd taken a picture of it, because it's a little bit hard to describe. It had obviously been tampered with. The outside portion of the door handle held in place with screws was now completely missing. The lock component of the handle was missing too. Essentially, all that was left behind was a stripped handle with a hole in the middle where the keyhole should be. My mom, having heard about the knocking incident from me the night before, was not cool with this all and insisted I report this. I contacted maintenance and the police, but there are no cameras situated near my apartment, and definitely not near my door. I've gotten no additional information as of now. In talking with my neighbors, who were obviously made aware of the vandalism as well, nobody who was at home or awake around that time heard anyone knock on their door, or came in contact with, or saw the man I described. Maybe I'm overthinking a bit, but this does make me nervous. It makes the approach seem much more targeted and less random, as if the person knew I'd be there alone. For what it's worth, at least the outside door handle was replaced very quickly that afternoon, and nothing like that has happened ever since. This is definitely a childhood memory of mine that I will never forget. I'm female and 22, by the way. Growing up, my aunt and uncle owned a beach condo. My favorite way to spend the summer was to stay there with my family, specifically my cousin Charlie. We were absolutely inseparable growing up. There was a 1-year difference between us. The beach we stayed at was a very popular tourist beach on the SC coast. So, in the summer, it was incredibly busy. I mean, barely any room between you and the family next to you. Now, my family would spend all day on that beach, from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. The beach would stay crowded until about 5, when everyone would go back to their rooms to shower and go out to eat. This meant from around 5 to 7 every day. That was my favorite time to be outside. We would have all the room to run wild, build sandcastles, dig huge holes. We wouldn't have to worry about people knocking them down or being too close. Around 5:30 p.m. one day, my family decided they wanted to walk to the pier about 2 miles away. Charlie and I, though, begged to stay behind so we could build sandcastles together. We were 9 and 10 at the time, so they said we could stay as long as we didn't get in the water or leave our spot. The condo we stayed at was 1 row back, and we were not allowed to cross the street without adults. We agreed to their terms and continued to build the row of sandcastles as they walked off into the distance. Around 5 minutes later, though, this extremely tall man wearing this floppy beach hat, sunglasses, and with a dollop of sunscreen on his nose came running straight up to us. He started by commenting how beautiful our sandcastles were, asking how long it took us to build them that high. He also asked if it was just the two of us working on them. We were both extremely introverted kids. We thanked him and kept our answers short, and tried to ignore him as he stood there watching us. All of a sudden, he got real quiet and started to glance around at the mostly empty beach. Then he said he had to go meet a friend of his. He told us to stay right there so he could bring his friend back to look at how great our sandcastles were. Then he jogged away from us. When he'd gotten a safe distance, Charlie and I both looked at each other and said, "We've gotta get out of here." Side note, hell yeah at us for being smart kids. We immediately started weighing our options. We knew our family wouldn't be back for at least another 30 minutes. We also knew we weren't allowed to cross the street, and quite frankly, we were scared to. About 100 yards away, though, was a tiny ramp overlooking the ocean. I believe it was a handicap access to the beach, as well as just a place to sit down, I guess. We grabbed our big shovels and decided to hollow out underneath that thing enough to where we could crawl under and not be seen. It didn't take us very long, since the high tide over the years had taken out a good 3 feet of sand underneath. Our adrenaline was rushing mad fast, too. We took our shovels inside with us and crawled underneath. The man was still yet to be seen. I assume it took us all of 8 minutes to climb under the pier and bury it again. Our heads were partially visible above the sand horizon, and we started freaking out, thinking he would surely be able to spot us if he just looked hard enough. There were 2 boogie boards lying about 50 feet away, though. It looked like some kids had abandoned them there. We grabbed them and propped them up against the ramp, covering our crawl space and the top of our heads from sight. Charlie curled up in a ball and cried, while running scenarios by me that we were definitely going to get taken. I tried my best to calm him down and say everything was going to be okay. Our parents would be back soon enough. I definitely felt like crying myself, though. The whole thing was so weird. I knew that since we both had such a bad feeling about the situation, especially at such a young age, this man was definitely having sinister intentions. Charles and I tried to peek out of the tiny slits where the boogie boards curved, and eventually saw the man walking back. He didn't have anyone with him, which we definitely thought he would since he said he was going to bring friends. As we observed, we noticed the man had seen we were gone. He turned around several times, checking to see if we were in the ocean or by the dunes. Once he realized and didn't seem to notice us that we were gone, he got extremely angry. He started huffing, puffing, stomping around. He looked over to our sandcastles and kicked them all down. We'd built a ton over the course of the day and basically had a gigantic wall of them. He made sure to kick every single one down before storming away. We stayed under that ramp thing for 45 more minutes until our family got back. We were way too scared to come out, especially after seeing the man's irrational reaction. We cried and told our family what had happened, and of course, they didn't believe us. We still talk about it sometimes at family gatherings or holidays. Both of us still remember it like it was yesterday. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.